So yes, I think this is about the time to start our talk here on ritual. So I'm going to start off here and share the screen. Let's see. There we go. Now, as I go through here, stop me at any point if you have a comment or you think of what I've put together here is wrong or off. And don't worry about the layout of the slides. It may look a little bit more formal than it is, hopefully. And I will excuse myself off front too. That's saying I am a Capricorn with Mercury in the 8th house and Sun in the 8th house. So I can be a bit too much on the structure. So anyway, idea of ritual at the topic came up last week after we were looking at how do we create sacred space. So the next thing comes from really looking at, well, what is a ritual and what are the components within a ritual? And a couple reasons to look at this is one, if we understand what is happening in the ritual, we can certainly get the most out of this. And I keep thinking of part of a letter I had seen. I had this book, I was studying William Law, who had been a Jacob Boehme sort of theosophist in the 17th century. And he had been writing about mysticism. And this young man had written to him saying, I really like the sort of esoteric Christianity you're talking about, but there's no one around that by me. So what can I do? And William Law says, well, just go to the nearest church. Just go to the regular Christian church service. Because if you experience things mystically, that's an inner experience anyway. And you can use the structure and the ritual of the mainstream church to have your mystical experience. So the more we understand of really what's happening within the ritual itself, the more we can get out of it. And also the more we can both get out of it internally and externally. And we can start seeing elements of ritual around us. In the works of Alice Bailey, when they talk about this, she talks about the 7 rays. There's actually the 7th ray is the ray of what they call ceremonial magic. But what this is also about ritual and symbolism and order and chronology, and that well, the world itself, nature, corresponds to order. We've got the solstice coming up next Monday morning. All these things are elements and potentials for ritual, as would be the full moon later on Thursday, next week, Thursday. So another reason is to look at the rituals to really get the most out of them, to both for the people conducting them or the people participating, if there's a difference. And also to look at, to recognize that there are hints that refer to rituals within art and ancient scripture, and that I know myself and others are very interested in this idea of finding the hidden rituals within some of this lost Gnosticism and lost Christianity. But also when we read esoteric literature and even poetry, we'll find references. Probably the most common is when we see references to the cup. And often they're referring to, or chalice, they're referring to the cup used in Holy Communion. Or it might be the Grail, but or that might be the same thing if we go with A.E. Waite's. And that's a topic in itself. So I thought using kind of my own background, which is admittedly very Western, both Western, Western from the high church Christian and Gnostic Christian church perspective, and also from my time in ceremonial magic and paganism. So I was hoping we'd have some of our experts in Eastern religion on here, but can't have everything. So what I plan to do is to kind of quickly go through these as to how they relate to in rituals in general, and what are the elements that happen in these. Now, when I was first starting with putting together this list, I thought, okay, we've just gone through creating sacred space. So that would be step one. But after a little thought, realized that no, whoops, sorry. I hit the wrong button. I know that really the first step is really our intent. Why are we doing the ritual? What do we hope to accomplish? And also the frame of mind, our attitude. Growing up Lutheran, Lutherans have this idea called justification. And what it really means is that you should be in the right frame of mind as you come into the church. And if you're not there right away, you should get there before the service starts, which means clearing your mind and letting the words of forgiveness and other these things set. And if you can't do that, you're really not supposed to take communion. But it is this idea of intent. So these are kind of some of the common things that, I know of talking about Christian rituals with a friend. He said, yeah, I just knew that we had to go to church or we go to hell on Sunday. If we don't go, well, not hell on Sunday, but if we don't go to church on Sunday, we will go to hell. Which, seems a bit harsh, especially because, because being Roman Catholic, you could give forgiveness the next week anyway. But so these are just some common things, of often things that we believe, well, these can easily be transformed. So rather than I have to go to church because it's Sunday, that this is a time that I can escape from the world. I've had friends say, no, I can't do this. I've got to meditate. I told myself I'm going to meditate every day, and damn it, I'm going to meditate. I don't know. I think I've talked about this with friends. I don't know what your views are. They say, oh no, then I sit down and I meditate and I feel better afterwards. Maybe sometime. I know I found myself when I'm really, really in a mood and I really don't want to meditate. If I force myself, I can't concentrate. And I keep thinking about other things anyway. So I usually don't.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because sometimes when I meditate when I don't really want to, or I'm in a bad mood or whatever, I still think something valuable happens, but it's probably not deep meditation. Usually by the end of it, I've managed just about to let go of the crap that I was holding on to. And it's done that. If nothing else, it's done that. And so maybe there's a benefit still, but I wouldn't claim to be entering any deep states of reflection.
Yeah, I think that's where I am. It's kind of, you can, it kind of settles me down, so I'm not ready to tear somebody's head off, but it's vice versa. And then, there's a whole thing. I think the third one of this idea of going to ceremonies because we're going to meet people for the social aspect instead of the serious aspect. I think that's a double edged too, because I think even people who go to the church or the other rituals for purely for purely trite or social reasons, they're still getting something out on an unconscious level.
Yeah, I think,
And
and I
if-
think I wouldn't underestimate that value as well, because I think, whatever we think is going on, whether it's raising our consciousness or we're encountering the divine, however we put it, that can happen through other people as much as it can sort of what we call the horizontal. So it can happen as much through the horizontal of other people as it can the vertical of our focus upwards or whatever. So I think it can still be valuable.
yeah, and I think I do see that that's one of those things where people have different needs, and I remember being at pagan, well, All Hallows Eve, Samhain events with pagans, where it seemed like you would have one group who really want to get into the whole sort of lifting the veils and the seriousness of Samhain. And then you got the group that wants to celebrate a party because everybody's there. And it's beginning of the new year, and there's this bit of this tension between these. And then I think I just put the third one in there, as I must have been thinking about money magic at the time. Of whether or not, that's another thing, of whether or not these sorts of petitions are right. But after we got the intent, part of it, we talked about a lot about this last time, was creating the sacred space. Yeah, we talked about setting up the altar a lot, the ritual space. I think in many of the rituals I've been to, there's a sense of a procession, either a procession by everyone involved or a procession from the clergy, where everybody as a group creates a sacred space. I know in some like the Martinist orders, they will do a gradual procession of all people into finding their seats. And meanwhile, it's typically, you'll see in the Christian churches, it's usually just the clergy's procession in.
Yeah, Pam, I was thinking about some forms of Freemasonry as well, where you have, and Diana, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but in many lodges, they have someone called the Tyler, who is the one who basically closes off the temple once everyone who's supposed to be in it is in it. So that even that act is kind of saying, that's the outside world. This is a sacred space for doing something different. It's like an acknowledgement, isn't it, that we're here to do something different.
Yeah, I think so. It very much is. I know in Memphis Mizraim Masonry, often the non-officers will file in, sitting on both. They'll sit in the rooms are rectangular, Dinah, and you have the master mason sitting on one, the other the apprentice is sitting in the other area. And then there's a certain amount of squaring the space and spiraling that officers do in Memphis, and then spiral out, almost to create like an energy pattern of that's part of the spatial definition. And of course, we have things such as music and incense, lighting the candles And I've been in some rituals, you know, the lights will come on overhead. Some rituals, when you start, the lights go down and the candles go up. And these are things that when we're doing rituals from ourselves in our own house, we can make use of. I know one of my projects is I've been working with energies around the 7 rays. And in the work of Leadbeater, he had separate crosses set up for each spot for the 7 rays, almost like as if you had like mini altars set up, which I live, you know, I have one lounge building here, that lounge room that serves as my dining room and the lounge and my art and everything else. So there's not the space for that. And I was thinking, how do I get this idea of a different ray? And then I bought myself some colored floodlights, which I don't have space, but I do have white walls. You know, so we can use some of this technology. I've been in places where they've done rituals by putting up different mandalas projected from the computer screens, and that in order to create the space, make the safe space. Some people put in, you know, beautiful scenery, flowing river, and that would be a way too, when we'll talk about the elements in a little bit. So there's part of, once the space is defined as being sacred, to kind of keeping it sacred and removing the distractions. Consecration, which is going into the space itself. Sometimes this happens with the leader before the other people are there, to just do a little bit of blessing or clearing out energy, especially when you're in rented accommodations and there's been a group before you doing who knows what. And part of this, all this is creating the world, is really creating the atmosphere so you can start entering and building the imaginal world. I remember talking to some Masons after somebody had shared a number of pictures online of Egyptian temples. And these were people I'd been working with for a couple years. And one of them asked me, they said, well, is it okay? I was a worshipful venerable master, so that's why they asked me these questions. They said, is it okay if I have this picture of an Egyptian temple in my mind? You know, that I have a temple area in my mind, some sort of other sacred space in my mind when we're doing ritual. And I thought, whoa, I hope you have something more sacred in your mind where you're doing this. You know, that, you know, there should be these sort of imaginal worlds that we can create around ourselves in order to make part of the ritual more sacred. And then an imaginal space is part of it. So once the space has been made sacred, defined, and it's accepted as sacred by everyone there's often a welcome. And then in Western, we have what is called in pagan circles, calling the quarters. And this happens a little bit even in some of the Christian ceremonies. Certainly in the Gnostic one, you can kind of eke this out, where there's a reference to the 4 directions, or there's a reference to the 4 archangels, or to the 4 elements. And this is also part of that, of the definition and the defining of the space. And of course, part of this also is movement and asana. And I find it helpful, even if I'm in my own house and I'm doing some sort of ritual, as I start the opening, to just walk around, and to just have the boundaries there, even if no one's going to be coming in and disturbing me or not, just to help it to be defined.
I think that's right, Pam. And I think that when I've been in rituals of a magical description, often people are almost before the rituals begun, they're kind of stalking around the space. So it's almost like the energy is there already. It's kind of everything's kind of warming up, or people might be playing drums, or they might be,
Yeah.
singing quietly to themselves. It's almost like building expectation, isn't it?
Hmm. I think that's it. And after we go through this, I've pulled off a lot of Leadbeater's ideas of what are the etheric structures built at the different parts of the ceremony. But yeah, it is building the expectations, starting the stage. And then there's usually some sort of sense at this point of purification. Now, earlier on, when talking about creating the sacred space, there may have been some sort of little consecration there. But once a sacred space site, there's a more of the purification of people around. A spurging, a sprinkling with the water, and sensing is something we do within the church. And those are often done in pagan circles as well. I remember I was up at the Serpent Mound in Peoples, Ohio, there was a very informal sort of gathering for the solstice sunset there. But still, there was about 3 or 4 people that before you got near the mound, they were smudging you. You better have a good excuse to be ready if you didn't want to be smudged, because you were about to enter this sort of sacred area. Then after this, at least within the Christian churches, as part of this, there's often a point of, at this point, there's also the self-examination, confession of sins, forgiveness of sins. But part of these, even if one doesn't tie themselves much to the idea of sin, these are all about emptying the mind and getting rid of all of those thoughts that are pounding into you, so that because we've already purified the outer part, now it's a time to just kind of cleanse the inner self and to take a few cleansing breaths. Sometimes this is even done in a group where we're working with doing some breath work. I've been in groups where at this point, after a few individual cleansing breath, there's this work to kind of breathe as a group. Even just the chanting of Om or something, gets that whole group identity going and gets it purified.
I was just thinking, and it might, the order is always slightly different depending on which context, but often there's like an opening prayer, isn't there? That it is almost kind of a restatement of like some sort of cosmology. So often there's like, I'm going to say something to whichever entity we're praying to, but often when I'm doing it, I'm describing the universe, that the worldview that we're in the ritual inhabiting. So it might be, oh Lord, who created the heavens and the earth, you who did this and you who did that, and we're here because You know, so it's almost like it acts as like a context setting, and also like a reminder of, oh, this is the worldview we're inhabiting.
Yeah, I think that's really a good point, you know. See that too, is that there is and there is that part of reinstating the cosmology. And I've been thinking a bit about, I was thinking about this a bit earlier, about why all the various versions of Christianity, all the various versions of Gnosticism, all have kind of their own take on Genesis and and why, and some sort of similar idea to Genesis, that that experience, like how did the world create and how was evil created, seems to be kind of so important. And yeah, it is there in a lot of the rituals that of that we kind of restate or recreate the cosmology. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think also that most cosmologies or cosmological statements are ultimately anthropological statements, aren't they? So, you know, often what we're saying about the universe is what we feel about ourselves. And so, yeah, there's like the big creation out there, and then there's the little creation in here. And so you often are drawing that parallel, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah, that's really good. And I think part of that is this sort, yeah, it is that that affirmation, of here we are ourselves. There, this is my place within the whole world of things. Um, and I think there are cultures. I'm trying to remember specifically from something I say, Shaman, that there are cultures that kind of restate that sort of, this is how the world came to be, or even in Masonry, where on the Masonic altar, it's open to John 1. It's open to, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and nothing exists except for the Word, or something like that. So yeah, I think these are the reinstatement in that. And some rituals themselves are really a recreation of cosmology. I seem to think that I remember reading about a number of the Native American rituals that really are a sort of a reenactment of parts of how the world came to be. And I'll have to look a little bit more like that on that.
I think Tibetan Buddhist mandalas are often doing the same, Pam. When people, are laying them out with colored chalk and things. It's and in Haitian voodoo as well. I think that these are kind of cosmological drawings that as we're laying them out, we're remaking the cosmos almost.
Yeah. I'm thinking there was this film, kind of a hokey film with vampire bats, but which was really good, called Nightwing. And one of the subplots in this book, it was set on this Navajo reservation. It begins with this Navajo shaman who's making a sand mandala, and he tells his apprentice, his student, that I'm making this, and then I'm going to start the world on fire. I'm making this, I'm recreating this, and now we'll set the world on fire as part of his almost prophecy part. So, and that actually gives us a hint, doesn't it? When we start looking at some of these some like the ancient Gnostics or some other groups, and we think about what kind of rituals did they have. That some rituals were just the recreation of myths, especially myths that are important for that particular time. Well, it's even what we do in what's even done like in Christian churches in that for Christmas or on these various different cyclical times. That's why there are people who go to Stonehenge every year for the summer solstice. We've got Thompson Rock up here, and there's a lot of people go up there, which is this large rock with a hole in the center that one can watch the summer sunset through this hole about yay big in this rock that's about 4 feet deep. That's perfectly aligned. So we have these sort of recreation rituals, I guess, happening all the time. So then there are other sort of activities, such as we were talking about songs, chants, readings, that are all about kind of building up anticipation, building up, stabilizing it, and creating the power. And then once things are firm, these go further then into raising the power, through dance, through other sort of energy work, song, chants. I know I had been for a while when I was living in Chicago, I would attend this church, and after the ceremony and after the sermon, as they would do the collection plate, they would just do the songs, and it was usually the same song or same sort of songs over and over again. That's just people would, and there was a lot of free extension on the songs happening, and it was just build and build and build. And so there's all this sort of raising the power.
Yeah, it reminds me of both kind of Pentecostal churches, but also in Sufism, where you've got like the remembrance of the name of Allah, and and just the chanting of the attributes of Allah, and it is very hypnotic, isn't it? And it's trance induction.
Yeah. And when one does like some of the mantras, Gayatri Mantra, the other mantras that are supposed to be done 108 times, there's a certain point where something kind of, clicks into the consciousness of where it becomes almost one with the mantra itself. And we start getting at that point where we're almost ready for we're raising things up. We're making requests at this point, and all of the energy is out there and building. And I think some of this even happens maybe with shamanic healing and energy work, where you get to this point where all the energy then is available for the priest or the shaman to use. The petitions have gone out there, and it builds toward this climax, which it's some sort of a communion often. In fact, that's what the word communion means. It's a coming together. So whether it's a sort of a Eucharist or a trance work, journeying, some sort of mystical union.
So Pam, I remember having a conversation with excuse me, Michael Van Buren, who you might know. He's a liberal Catholic bishop, and he argued that a lot of churches were really good at raising the power, but weren't very good at doing anything with it once it was raised. And do you think in Gnostic churches where the Eucharist is quite central, and so, at the point where you're basically invoking Jesus into the bread, effectively, you're kind of saying, you're because you're raising all this power and directing it towards the Logos or Christ, and you're calling it into those elements. Is that accurate from your point of view?
Yeah, that's where the energy should get focused. And that's where during the Eucharist, you have the elevation of the bread, of the host at one point.
Yeah.
Where that should be, all the congregation should be looking there, the priests and the clergy who are up at the altar, they should all be looking there. And that's where the energy gets focused there in the bread, and then again in the chalice. And then it should be so then the climax happens. So after the energy gets raised there, the climax happens at the, with the clump consumption. So the individual person's climate, that should be almost a sense of a mystical union, of becoming one with the body and the blood. And everything should die down after that point. That's where I think some of the churches have it a bit wrong, where they kind of continue to do some sort of singing, because really what people should do is have a little bit of meditation and kind of general reflection and kind of easing of and absorbing of the energies. This is when the magical aspect happens within communion, within the service, is at this sort of Eucharist where the energy goes into it. And that's actually why in Roman Catholic churches, they have the tradition of putting the bread directly into a person's mouth. And that's because otherwise people were pocketing the host to use for their own magical work they had to do at home. Maybe they had a sick cow, or they needed some money for this new stove, whatever it was. That people were taking these magical elements and using them. So
it's amazing what we do as human beings, isn't it?
It is. It's kind of goes into why they started to burn the witches, because people were figuring that they were the ones who had power and were stealing body parts, and they just left them hanging. So in the Gospels, it even talks about at these points that this would be a point where there'd be some sort of mystical utterances. And it's in a few parts in the writings of Paul that there would be these sort of sense of prophecy that happens at this time. I think that's true of some of the Quaker church, and maybe in more, again, something more in the Pentecostal churches, where people are making more appropriate uses of energy. Yeah. And then after this happens, there's usually some sort of grounding in space, because, so even, for example, if we were talking about in a pagan circle, usually the culmination happens with the Kona power. And if people have been giving petitions or desires or trying to get rid of something in the fire or something, this is what that sort of climax is. And you can have oracles happening at this point. In Santeria rituals, as the energy has built up all the way, the communion with the divine almost becomes a physical communion, because as the energy gets built up, the Orisha, the spirits, come down into the priests who are open for them. And then during this period, there's actually the conversations or the questions given to the priest who at that time has become, possessed by the Orisha. And they're asked the questions, they're given the, and they're giving problem solving, or they're giving insight.
It's a bit like the oracle at Delphi as well, Pam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. It is where the, and it makes sense that that's where if there had been like sacred offerings, and that would have happened at this time as well. So after the energy peaks, there's often a grounding, whether it's just a thankful or prayers of thanks. In pagan circles, you just physically ground to the earth and take the energy that had come up and put it back into the earth. And thanking deities or angels that have come to help. And then it's always important to close a space, releasing any helpers, giving the benediction, the blessings of people, and then whatever form of exit happens.
Yeah.
And even when the same place, even the same space has to be used for something non-sacred, it's just especially needs to be kind of closed down.
And I often think, that having a time afterwards to either have food together or even just have coffee together and socialize can be like a really important way of grounding as well, Pam.
Yeah. I think that's really important, because sometimes the energy, the vibration gets high, and even after the ritual, there are individuals who often still haven't quite let loose of all the vibration. Grounding is certainly something easier for some than others. And I also think, it's like that socializing, also helps people kind of come down. And it's a gentle way of kind of leaving the, kind of hanging on to a part of the energy, but still letting go. Now, as I was going through the whole list, I wasn't quite sure where to put the idea of anointing, because I've been like in more pagan ceremonies where people are anointed almost as part of kind of creating the space. Sometimes you anoint people sometimes during a purification, absolution, but then also sometimes actually at that sort of communion point itself, that you are anointed with something so that you can take it back with you. That it's almost a sort of then of course as a blessing as well. Something you can take away. So
within kind of some branches of Hindu Tantra, they have this thing called Nyasa, which means placement, where you're placing mantras or even deities inside the person. And so I think often that would come after invocation, Pam. So you'd be calling upon the deity, and the priest or priestess would be calling upon. So the invocation has happened, and then there's an act of, well, the God is here, and now we're transferring that into you. But often, in some sort of initiation ritual or confirmation, I guess confirmation is a really classic one, isn't it? Because do you use chrism in confirmations?
You can use chrism in confirmation. You use a chrism in baptism as well. Yeah. And I was thinking about like Ash Wednesday. That's a sort of an anointing
Yeah, yeah, the
that goes
whole,
on,
yeah,
big thing. And that's when that, it stays with you. I remember kids coming back to school with the black cross in their heads.
yeah.
So yeah, I think and I, and it's one of these things that um, I don't think happens as much as it should within some of the Gnostic ceremonies. Because when we read about like the stories of Jesus and that, he's certainly doing a lot of anointing. You know, part of his healing is a lot of the placing on the hands, you know, and anointing people one way or another with.
Well, Christ means anointed one, doesn't it?
It
And
does. Maybe that's why.
yeah, yeah, and the idea of, so Christ is, Jesus becomes the Christ arguably at his baptism, so he's anointed with the Spirit. And as Gnostics, I think we should be doing far more anointing as a way of kind of marking gnosis, isn't it? It's like, and here we are transferring, and I think again in Hindu Tantra they talk about Shaktipat, don't they, where the transference of like divine energy. And I think, I think we should be getting into more of that.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. And
Because we talk a lot about apostolic succession and initiation and ordination and all these special ceremonies, but actually what behind all the fancy words and the robes, it's this transference of gnosis and power, and that we're really talking about, aren't we? Hopefully.
yeah. It's what we, and that's where I know in some of the Martinist circles, they've talked about getting away from these sort of formal, almost Masonic sort of initiation ceremonies and getting to just the laying on of the hands and the passing of knowledge that way, as had been, something quite a bit less elaborate, but had been done more on a one-to-one basis. And when we read some of the Hermetic literature, there seems, especially when there's Hermes is talking to Tart, or that, like in some of the, Pomerades, that's very much that sort of, kind of closeness of the hands and the passing of power that way. And yeah, I think we should have more. I've got images now of like some of the Reiki initiations going through in my mind. But it's a similar sort of power. And maybe, think about, why have we been so stingy with power? It's not like you lose any of it. Well, okay, you can, you're not going to lose it by passing it on to good people, to people who you're working with, or passing on to people who are accepting it with love. It's
yeah, and I think it's almost like in the Gurdjieff work, they have this whole idea of feeding on energies. Both we are being fed upon by other energies in the world, but we need to feed upon energies that enrich us. And I suppose the Eucharist from a Gnostic perspective is an example of that feeding, isn't it? Where we're saying, hey, here's this Jesus, this exemplar of the Logos. We are taking him into ourselves so that we may become the Christ or the Logos. So, and so that's going on, that's going on all over the place. And I think and that's very shamanic. And I think our Gnosticism needs to become more shamanic.
Yeah. Yeah, because yeah, what we're doing there, here we are feeding the indwelling Christ. I like that. I like that as a theme for another talk. You know, how to make narcissism more shamanic.
Yeah.
How do we become more shamanic? Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a really good. I think someone wrote a book called Shamanic Christianity or something, and I thought that was an interesting concept. You know, that because I think Gnosticism is shamanic Christianity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know, it's a form of saying this isn't about belief; it's about becoming the thing that you're inspired by. You know, and I think that's much more dangerous but exciting.
Okay, what here? Okay. So I want to share these. These are just images. I was looking for when I was looking for things to insert here and how I usually use images. I came across this version of Leadbeater's Science of the Sacraments. And so Science of the Sacraments is this thick little book. I think it's about 685 pages or so, where Charles W. Leadbeater goes through the Christian Mass in detail about how he sees the energies working, what the priest should be thinking about at various times, what the deacons maybe should be thinking about, where should energy be focused, what sort of crosses should you use, and every sort of question you can. And this became, while this initially started with Leadbeater's Church of the Liberal Catholic Church, this has also been used as the prime manual for Christian sacraments by both Gnostic and independent sacramental people. And it has a wealth of knowledge in there. There's few places one might want to cringe if modern humor, but but there's a lot of good in there. And one of the best things in this is that he talks about how energy gets created. And this is probably about the best source of it. He talks about how energy is created during the Christian Mass. So this is the first start. So the priest right here is in red. You got congregants all on the side. So as it starts with the priest, with the celebrant, creating the asperger bubble. They stand here and they start to asperge both the altar first, and then the whole area of the sanctuary is asperged. And with the words and with the chorus, this starts becoming a little bulb that, as we said earlier, defines a sacred space, purifies and defines a sacred space. And this is the cross section of what it might look like. Then after we get to the point of starting to call in the angels and really to expand and create the sacred spire, expand the energy as we start going through the creeds. The whole energy begins to be expanded by the angel. And one of the interesting things about sacred sacraments, he actually talks about the angel of the Eucharist. And that when the angels come down into the church service, and helps the priest. So this this purple, while the red here is the celebrant, this purple is the angel of the Eucharist standing right behind him and helping build the space. So the sacred space is built with the help of angels. Something they never taught us in Protestant Lutheranism. Really quickly. This next part is an interesting part here. During the songs, which again, we were in the area of stabilizing and that, the bubble begins to form. And also within the service, at this point, the quarters have been called. So the service around it becomes, instead of being just a slope bubble, it becomes more of a rectangular, oblong sort of bubble thing. And the interesting note here, this will be on the next slide here, is that the bubble encloses the four corners of the pavement around the sanctuary. And here he shows the pavement as he sees it. And this is a cross-section of that pavement. This is a previous slide we were just looking at. But one of the things, interesting things at this, and this would apply to the sort of tessellated floor that's there in Masonic lodges as well as in churches. He actually sees the tessellated floor, where's my cursor here, as going down, you know, as inverted triangles here, going down deep into the earth. And that the tessellation itself of these sort of tile floor becomes these conical pyramids that are pushing energy into the earth itself. So what's happening here is building above and reaching up the higher worlds, if we would, the upper world, the humanity toward the upper worlds by the angel of the Eucharist. But then there's also this work of vivifying the earth itself. And once I saw this, I've never been able to look at tessellated floors quite the same way.
He had a very, very active imagination, did R. Leadbetter, didn't he?
Yes, he did. So whether it's how much of this is psychic, I've read articles that supposedly from other psychics who have seen similar things during the Eucharist, but it's not all that well documented. But I had never seen this idea before of the floor going down. And yeah, so of course we use a lot of tessellated floors often in bathrooms too. So I think about energy being pulled below it. Okay. During the Introit, which is really the beginning of the ceremonial part, the bubble becomes even higher and actually starts to spiral a little bit, going as energy goes upward. So this almost reminded me of like a cone of tower, as a vortex energy around the altar starts to build up. And from the building, he sees little sort of pebbles forming, you know, and of course he brings in ideas like of some of the, especially of the Eastern churches, where you've got these domes and these spirals coming up, like in the Hagia Sophia and such. Gradually, these squares build up to be almost a rectangular. And here we have the little altar here still shown in the cross section. And an oblong form of it becoming larger and larger. And here he shows how he sees it coming up from around the main part of the altar, but with, what does he have here? There's nine different spheres coming up. and he gives the bowls that create during the Kyrie. And the energy builds up. And then here we can see the idea that so many of the churches, Eastern churches have, of course, is building up during the Gloria. Yeah. And I think this is the
do you think there's any connection between this? I'm trying not to be facetious, so you'll forgive me. But do you think there's any connection between this and the bishop's mitre? Because I'm just thinking, like a mitre is like the same sort of shape, isn't it? Like, is it? But I'm thinking also about halos. Not that I'm saying that you always don't have a halo, Pam, but you know, but is it symbolizing that sort of
it's symbolizing that sort of energetic power.
Yeah.
And I think actually Leadbeater talks about the mitre doing that as far as like its conical shape, you know, pushing the energy up and also becoming almost a holding pin to help bring the energy down as well. Because essentially you've got a cone on your, you know, you look at how a mitre is flat, you know, and it becomes kind of this cylindrical cone that sits on the top of the head.
Yeah, you're not doing religion right unless you've got a pretty silly hat involved, as far as I'm concerned.
That's it. Yeah. You know, and so many of like sacred hats are seen like this, and it actually reminds me too. I've been, you know, they talk about that even back in Neolithic time, they found these sort of gold hats that look like this, but with ridiculously high spirals on them that were probably used for some sort of ceremony during the Bronze Age.
Yeah.
Nobody quite knows what, but again, they become amplified ideas to bringing down the power. You know, the whole dunce cap or magician's cap being these sort of cone of power things. And equal point, here's an image found online of a pagan sort of idea of the code of power coming up with
those people have definitely got lightsabers, Pam. That's what I'm saying. They've got lightsabers.
I know. Yeah, they have lightsabers, and it was reminded me of a pagan festival I was at once, where you had all the women in their center, but somehow you needed men on the quarter to protect them, and it just offended me. I think I chose to stay at the campsite and drink beer on that one, and it really. But it was the only good cone of power picture I could find.
I love it. I like the lightsabers, and my lightsaber bearers are of both and many genders.
That's right. That's why I convinced myself that okay, they were nothing to. You can't really tell that they could be multiple female genders as well. And you know, whether it's lifesavers or swords, you know, there is that sort of protective energy coming up. And so this is the end of what I had to discuss about ritual. So I
thank you, Pam. That's been really helpful. It's been really nice.
Yeah. And I think it's something that, you know, right now we're all outside, but one of the things we do try to do in the Gnostic Church is to, you know, let people kind of even folks who are non-clergy know kind of how you should participate within the structure of the church at each time, and then it just becomes a bit more alive to you too, rather than counting down the minutes. No. So let me stop the share here. Stop share. There we go. So that's it. Does anyone else have any other questions before we go?
Oh no, I was just waving. I was just waving at Dinah's son.
I know he's been so good. Well, he's on mute. So hi there.
Yeah, I suppose Pam, I suppose it does raise a question, doesn't it? Like about thinking about our church in the UK about I get the sense, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the organization in America has the church bit of it, but also the Masonic bit of it, and also the Martinist bit of it. So there's lots and lots of ceremony going on.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then I suppose the question is, for us, where we're predominantly thinking about the church bit of it because of just our energy and our small numbers and stuff, how we want to. But then again, it makes sense for the Eucharist to be at the center of it because it kind of gives it shape, I guess.
I think it certainly gives it shape, and it gives a lot of about to historically what has been the service, what has been the practice of Gnostics before us, at least for the past 1500 years. And then even because there are hints in the going back to the book of Jude, they're certainly practicing different sort of, but Eucharists, very similar. And Jesus still is coming, visiting, practicing Eucharist. So it is a main sacrament. How we expand from there? How do and at what point does the Eucharist become more of a free or looser? I remember, I think there's something to look at from like the Young Rite. The Young Rite being kind of a breakaway from the liberal Catholic. But I remember the first time I was in a Young Rite service, and what they do when it comes to the time of Eucharist, they would come together as a circle, and then instead of having the priest dispense Eucharist, they actually would go around the circle. One person, passing the bread, and then passing the cup to the person next to you all the time. So your fellow churchmate is actually providing the Eucharist, no matter what a person's regardless of any sort of clergy level. If children were doing this, and so it was a lot more open. And I have to say that I initially was rather taken aback because I'm from the stuffy backgrounds. But
that sounds very like, I spent my teenage years in quite kind of charismatic Christian circles, and that sort of practice of passing that, you take the bread and the wine, then you pass it to the next person. That was kind of really familiar. That sort of, but then again, it is from a much more sort of low church, informal sort of place.
And that actually, going back to the 2nd century, that's how the Gnostics worked. Irenaeus, in some of the writings of the Church Fathers, he's complaining about the local Gnostic group in Lyon that are every week they draw straws for next week to see who's going to be the celebrant and who's going to do this or that, and then they just pass the duties around. And Irenaeus was quite taken aback, and his point was like, well, if you're going to do that, why have a formal clergy at all? Of course, 100 years later, Pelagius would say, why?
It's like the Quakers, yeah.
Yeah, 100 years later, Pelagius say, well, yeah, why have a clergy at all? And it's even when we read parts of some of the other Celtic saints, I get this impression as I read them that it was more of that sort of egalitarian sharing. And of course, when you'd have people, you'd have individuals going through these remote areas where all you've got is people like, Saint Cuthbert or Saint Ninian. They're baptizing people, making them Christians, but then leaving them. So obviously there's no priest there. People are doing some sort of Christian celebration. So it may not have been so formal. In fact, the whole workings of what we consider to be the modern mass now, really weren't in place till like the 7th century. So there's a lot of this sort of, lot of room. We don't have to do it the same old way. I think it's what it comes down to. Going forward. So
yeah. I mean, and how if you share these ideas with Bishop John in America, would he fall over, or is he pretty cool, or is he feeling this kind of more Protestant way of doing things, Pam? Because you know what I'm like. I'm a bit of an anarchist.
Yeah, I'm a bit of an anarchist too, and I haven't talked to I haven't talked to Monsignor John.
Yeah. But I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive, though, are they? I think you can still have good formation of clergy and good and mature people, but you can still then improvise and be more freeform within that.
Yeah, and I think especially when there's when you're working with more ordinary time and that sort of thing, and there's unless there's some sort of reason, I think so. Because the big thing is that, and it gets us over the problem that has faced the modern Gnostic Church, is that in order to, I don't want to say get ahead, but in order to progress, it was seen that one has to take on holy orders. But meanwhile, the more the scriptures have been available, especially the Nag Hammadi, the Gnostic scriptures have been available, people become more educated on it. Everybody asks why? Because my pursuit of gnosis is my individual pursuit, and I can do this. I could do this perfectly well without somebody giving me a stamp of approval within an initiatory setting. Now, yes, there is power that gets passed with initiations, but that's not the only power that's out there. And I don't think that it's not the only power that's out there. And there are certainly individuals who have a lot cleaner, conduit to the divine than clergy. We know this, we know this historically.
Well, yeah, and you also have like the phenomena of monastics who were often lay people. They never even became priests, did they, or bishops? They were just spiritual practitioners.
And in Dionysius, spiritual, in his ecclesiastical hierarchy, in spiritual hierarchy, in ecclesiastical hierarchy, he puts the monks, the monastics, above the bishops as far as like spiritual and as far as religious authority. That the priests in Dionysius' work, the priests are there to really instruct with the deacons, to instruct and get in more congregants and that, and catechumens that. and do that with the population. The bishops are there as far as administrative roles to keep things going within the church itself and to resolve disputes, et cetera, but it's really the monastics who have dedicated themselves to the complete spiritual path, and that under in Dionysius construct, they're the ones that actually have the clear insight.
Which kind of fits with your vision for the oblates, in the sense that kind of devotional and meditative approach needs to be there for all of us, not just clerics or all monastics, just for everyone who's involved. It's that's how we access gnosis.
Yeah. I think it's a better model than this thing of like, well, you've got to go through holy orders or be nothing. That's the whole idea of holy orders, and those sorts of titles are really those are a worldly concern.
Or like you say, they're a function within the church that's really important, but we mustn't mistake one for the other.
Yeah. I think that's it. I think that's exactly what it is. And and I so that is kind of more my visions, that you've got orders and individuals that are dedicated in their pursuit to gnosis, and those of us who are clergy within the church, we're there to help support that and to do the sort of structure growth thing that organizations do.
Well, that might be a really interesting topic for another talk, Pam, is like the initiatory value of the minor orders. Maybe might be one talk, and then the clerical orders for another one, just to kind of help people understand them.
Yeah, that would be a good easy talk to do. So maybe I think that might be a good one for next time. How's that?
Yeah, well, but maybe doing the minor orders as one talk, and then the clerical orders, because it kind of creates like the trajectory, and then people can have a sense about how they might want to tap into that or not. That'd be helpful.
Yeah, I think that would be good, and I'll kind of tag in some of our other members who have had interests but haven't quite been able to make it to things.
Yeah, you want to say, look, if you want to get on the career path, you better turn up for the talk. That's all I'm saying.
Get your individual development performance appraisal ready. Do those monthly check-ins.
Yeah, rather than the hippie dropouts like me. Yeah, that's fine.
or those like me who are like, well, I don't have a career path. It's like, how soon can I retire? Question.
Well, one of the things as well, I think sometimes about clerical orders is that they're thrust upon people rather than something they should have. So in some ways, it's like, I remember David Beth. I don't know if you know David Beth, Pam, but he was linked to Michael Berchio. But basically, someone said, look, we need to ordain you as a bishop because we need you to do something.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, oh, okay, damn. It's like, rather than this is something I want for my own kind of prestige or a fancy title or a great hat. It was like, no, this is because work needs to be done, and we need some of these people to make that, like you say, or to organize that.
And that's the story of like St. Cuthbert. St. Cuthbert, it was like 3 or 4 times before they finally got him to agree to become a bishop, because it wasn't what he wanted spiritually for himself. It wasn't in line with how he wanted to spend his time.
Yeah.
But
well, even St. Francis, I think they only ordained him as a deacon right at the end of his life, because he said, look, I'm just here as a humble brother. I'm here to, do minister to the poor. It's not about anything else.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So that's great. Okay,
great.
it was great seeing
Thank you
you
very
guys
much.
again. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
See you soon.
That's it.